Psalm 15. There are just a few verses there, and we will read them together. And my request of you is that you will keep your Bibles or your phones open to Psalm 15 through the sermon. We'll make use of the open page. Psalm 15. Verse 1. Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy mountain? He whose walk is blameless, and who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from his heart, and has no slander on his tongue, who does his neighbor no wrong, who casts no slur on his fellow man, who despises a vile man, but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps his oath even when it hurts, who lends his money without usury, and does not accept a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be shaken. The Psalm of David was written for, I think, kings and queens and rulers, governors, overseers, anyone with any kind of power over people, anyone in leadership, anyone in an administrative position of some type, anyone who desires to live and abide in the presence of God and rule in the way God rules. You're saying, well, how do you know that? I think you can figure that out when you notice that the psalm has something to say about the three important areas by which people exercise personal power. The psalm has something to say about how we use our words, speak truth, don't utter slander, don't cast a slur against your neighbor, keep your oath if you make a promise. Something about words. Next, it has something to say about how we use our judgment. It says, despise a vile person, but honor those who fear the Lord. Something about judgment. Next, it has something to say about how we use our money. It says, lend money to the poor without interest. Do not accept a bribe against the innocent. Anyone in any responsibility over people exercises power using these three means. We employ words, we use our judgment, and we put power to work tangibly with our money. David, in this psalm, has outlined 10 descriptions of the one who desires to govern and live the way God would govern. And that way I want to say anyone could get something from this psalm about how to live in God's presence. So there are 10 descriptions about anyone who lives in God's presence and who rules as God would rule. So follow along in this psalm. If you have a pencil, you can mark them down one by one, and you'll see the 10 descriptions. Number 1, walk blamelessly. That's in verse 2. That's the first description. This person walks blamelessly. Number 2, they do what is righteous. This is a positive command. They do what is righteous. Number 3, they speak the truth from their heart. First 3 are all from verse 2, okay? Now let's go to the next verse. This person's tongue utters no slander. That's number 4. Number 5, they do no wrong to their neighbor. Number 6, they cast no slur on their fellow man. Number 7, they despise a vile person but honor those who fear the Lord. That couplet is one. I'm going to count that as one description. Number 8, they keep an oath, they keep a promise, even when it hurts, and they don't change. That's number 8. Number 9, they lend money to the poor without interest. They're not predatory moneylenders. Number 10, they do not accept a bribe against the innocent. 10 descriptions of a person who dwells in God's presence. Does this remind you of anything? The 10 Commandments. That's right. These 10 descriptions remind us of the 10 Commandments. And if you pay attention, these 10 descriptions build on and expand some of the 10 Commandments. For instance, the description of the person who dwells with God as someone who speaks the truth, utters no slander, casts no slur on others. All of these build on the 9th commandment, which says, "You shall not bear any false witness against your neighbor." Now, that same description of the person who casts a slur on, or who doesn't cast a slur on others, someone who casts slurs on others, who slanders his or her neighbor, robs his or her neighbor of peace, does violence to that person's good reputation. Uttering slander about a person could cost that person his or her job, ruin their livelihood, and then handicap that person's ability to provide for his or her family. Now, this breaks the 8th commandment, which is, "You shall not steal." In a way, slandering someone, casting slurs upon their character, visits a type of violence on this person. And in that way, it also breaks the 6th commandment, which is, "Thou shalt not kill." Now, these 10 descriptions, we said, build on and expand the 10 commandments. Some of these descriptions, if you will pay notice, they go deeper and further and reach into the deeper righteousness which the 10 commandments are pointing to. Take, for instance, one of the most incisive descriptions in this psalm of a person who abides in God's tabernacle. That's the 7th description. It describes this person as someone who despises a vile person but honors those who fear the Lord. Now, that's a description of right judgment, right evaluation. It is saying that, let's say, a woman who abides in God's tabernacle, who lives on God's holy mountain, thinks highly of and wants to emulate those who are godly. A man who lives on God's holy mountain, that man's hero is not a vile person. His hero is someone who honors God. Michael Lewis is known as the chronicler of the 2008 financial crisis that hit Wall Street. He is known as the storyteller of some of the great stories of our culture, some of the most fascinating, particularly financial stories in our culture. Some of you may know his book, later turned into a movie, called Moneyball, where he wrote about using empirical analysis in baseball and assembling a winning baseball team using a small budget and hiring baseball players with particular skills. Some of you may have heard or read his book about the 2008 financial crisis called The Big Short. And his story that he described about the 2008 financial crisis put in very tangible ways the naked greed driving the reckless financial decisions that caused the 2008 financial crisis. Recently, Michael Lewis used his exceptional gifts to pen the story of a certain young man called Sam Bankman-Fried. I don't know if you've heard of him, if you've seen him in the news. The title of the book is Going Infinite: The Rise and Fall of a New Tycoon. It's the story of Sam Bankman-Fried and his cryptocurrency exchange company. It is the story that tracks the rise, the rampant fraud, the Ponzi-style scheme, all which led to its collapse. Lewis was able to have unique and extensive access to Bankman-Fried for the purposes of this book. Some of you may have seen in the news that Sam Bankman-Fried was tried, found guilty, was convicted on all 7 counts which were brought against him. He is now spending time for an 18 to 25-year prison sentence. It was one of the most stunning money laundering and fraud convictions in recent memory, according to news broadcasters. The amount misappropriated by this young man ran into the billions of dollars. I was watching an interview of Michael Lewis, the author of this book, and throughout the interview, Michael Lewis seemed fawning, adoring, deeply impressed by the fraudster, Bankman-Fried. The news interviewer was taken aback. This man committed fraud and fooled so many people, and yet you seem to be praising him. The psalm we read says, the person who lives in God's presence on God's holy mountain despises a vile person, but honors those who fear the Lord. By that it means that one who lives on God's holy mountain values, looks up to, wants to emulate a godly person. What we value, what we admire, what we despise, these are acid tests which uncover the deep orientation of our hearts, the deep condition of our soul. It uncovers the truth about whether we would truly enjoy being in the mountain of the Lord. 10 descriptions that we saw in this psalm, they build on and they expand the 10 commandments. They also, these 10 descriptions, they go deeper and further into the righteousness, the deeper righteousness which the 10 commandments point to. Now you can just imagine David sitting in his court with the leaders of Israel, his administrators, governors gathered in front of him, and David singing this psalm. It was kind of a musical TED Talk. He is teaching them through song what it looks like to pattern their leadership after the leadership of God, their governance after the way how God governs. Don't slander. Don't speak falsely. Orient your heart to value what God values. What is noble? What is good? Despise what is wrong, even when it is attractive, even when it gives you short-term gains. Employ the power of money for just causes. Don't take bribes. Don't charge interest and trap the poor in predatory lending. You can imagine his audience learning from the song. And the song makes the lesson even so much more memorable. Now, what makes this leadership poem, this song, very memorable and unique, it's not just these 10 descriptions. What makes this song so unique is the way it begins. Did you notice it? David says, Lord, Who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? Who may dwell on your holy mountain? I don't know how many of you have read this memoir when it came out. It's about Janet Walls. She wrote a memoir called The Glass Castle. Janet's parents, Rex and Rosemary, and her older sister Lori and her younger brother Brian, began their life in southern Arizona. Her earliest memory, she says, is of a time when she was trying to cook hot dogs wearing her favorite pink dress. She happened to be 3 years old. Her mom was in the next room singing. I stabbed one of the hot dogs with a fork and bent over to offer it to our dog, Juju. When I stood back up, I felt a blaze of heat over on my right side. Her pink dress had caught on fire. The flames reached her face and she screamed. The flames singed her hair and her eyelashes. Her mom rushed her to the hospital using a neighbor's car. Her dad had taken the car to go out somewhere. She was so badly burned on her right side that the doctor said she was lucky to be alive. They took patches of skin from her upper thigh and grafted it onto the badly burned parts on her stomach, ribs, and chest. While at the hospital, the nurses and the doctors were curious as to how she got these burns. Why were you cooking hot dogs by yourself? Oh, it's easy, she said. You just put the hot dogs in the water and you boil them. I fill the pan up with water. I put a chair by the stove. I turn on the stove, and when the water gets boiling, I drop the hot dogs in. Mom says I'm mature enough for my age, 3 years old. She lets me cook for myself a lot. This was the beginnings of a story that caused concern to all those who heard it. The father, Rex Walls, seemed to carry hints of intelligence, genius even. He was eccentric, but also a very erratic man. Their mother seemed to match them in eccentricity and erratic behavior. Rex Walls did not trust the doctors, did not trust the hospital. Once he found out that Jeanette was admitted to the hospital, he rushed there, picked her up, unplugged everything, and walked out. He did not trust didn't trust anyone in any civic institution. Rex battled demons of his own, alcohol, and other things. Rex often made promises he could not keep, especially to his family. A few months after Jeanette's hospitalization, Rex burst into their house in the middle of the night and demanded that they pack whatever they could, whatever could fit into the car. We need to leave, he said. They were on the road in their car. Jeanette, on her lap, had their gray and white cat, Quixote. She had him on her lap. The cat was terrified of being in a moving car, and he growled and scratched Jeanette's face. Her mom looked back from the front seat and explained, cats don't like being in a car. They don't like to travel. Her dad shouted from the front seat, anyone who doesn't like to travel isn't invited on our adventure. He stopped the car, grabbed Quixote the cat by the scruff of the neck, and tossed him out the window. Quixote landed with a screeching meow and a thud. Dad accelerated up the road, and I burst into tears, wrote Jeanette. They lived a nomadic life, leaving one home, living temporarily in another home, from one place to another. They'd run up bills in one place, and when things got unmanageable, they'd pull up stakes and move to another town. Most often, they lived out of their car. In one stretch, having run from one situation, they slept in the Arizona desert with only the stars for a canopy. Their dad, Rex Walls, sold the family on tall tales, on fighting harder, flying faster, smarter than anybody else. In all of his stories, he rescued women and children from men who weren't as smart as he was. When Dad wasn't telling us about all the amazing things he had already done, he was telling us about the wondrous things he was going to do. The most special of these projects that Rex Walls enthralled his children with were his plans, his future plans, to build a glass castle. All of Dad's engineering skills and mathematical genius were coming together in this one special project, a great big house he was going to build for us in the desert. It would have a glass ceiling and thick glass walls and even a glass staircase. The glass castle would have solar cells on the top and would catch the sun's rays and convert them into electricity. I guess this man lived before Elon Musk. It would use that electricity for heating and cooling and running all the appliances. It would have its own water purification system. Dad had figured out the architecture and the floor plans and most of the mathematical calculations. He carried the blueprints for the glass castle in the desert wherever he went. Sometimes he'd pull them out and let us work on the design for our individual rooms. All we needed to get to work on our glass castle, Dad said, was we needed to find gold. We were always on the verge of finding gold. Once he finished the prospector, he says, we would strike it rich and we'll start work on the glass castle in the desert. I needn't tell you that the glass castle never got built. Rex Will's promises, like most of his promises, never came true. Jeanette Wall's story is a deeply unsettling, deeply saddening story of continuous disruption, continuous disappointment, and instability. At the heart of this story is the promise to live in a castle in the desert where there is stability, where there is dependability, and a final rest from disappointment. The promise of living together as a family where they no longer need to pull up stakes and move. Nothing needs to be feared. There's plenty to eat. There's no packing up and moving. Is that too much for a child to ask? Our first parents were not just promised a beautiful home in the future, they were planted in a beautiful home right at the start. Much like Rex Wall's dream, this beautiful home was self-sustaining, fully equipped to be sustainable and self-sufficient. In addition, this home was a mountain home. 4 rivers streamed down from this home and fled the whole earth. God set them on this mountain home in Eden, lofty setting. God set them there, and when God finished it, God said, "It's very good. It's very good." This was most especially home because God walked with them, God dwelt with them, His presence was present there. There's no taint or curse or blight of sin. But as you know, our first parents chose to listen to the voice of the enemy, chose to distrust God. They joined Satan in his rebellion. They rejected the government of God and wanted to be governors themselves. They had to be evicted from their mountain garden home. And now we're outside. In the long, dark history of humanity that has followed, there has been one longing, the longing to go home. Poets and storytellers and composers and philosophers have all been tracing this longing in different names, in different ways, but the deep underlying theme has always been there. We want to go home, back to the mountain garden. Now, in the telling of the story of Adam and Eve and their tragic eviction from their mountain home, we possibly forget that God was on the other side of the gate. God was also longing that we would come home, that we would return to the mountain garden where He dwelt. But for us to cross through the gate and return to the mountain, our infection of sin needed to be cured. So God, in His infinite love, put a plan in place for us to come back and live in His mountain home. But Adam and Eve could not coexist with a holy God with their sinful infection. God, rather than waiting for us to get our act together, decides to leave the gates and come down to the plain and live with us. And God said to Moses, "Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them." The building of the sanctuary closely mimics the mountain garden home that Adam and Eve left. You will remember, to create this mountain garden home, it took 7 days. In Genesis 1, it records 7 speeches of God. In the building of the sanctuary, which God asks Moses to build, there are again 7 speeches, 7 stages of building the tabernacle. You will remember that in creation, God first creates empty spaces. God creates receptacles, and then God fills. The first 3 days, God forms, and the next 3 days, God fills those empty spaces. In the tabernacle, if you will read Exodus 25 to 32, the same pattern is used except in reverse. God asks Moses to first make the things that would fill the spaces, and then God asks Moses to build the spaces where those things could be filled. To make this parallel more pronounced, when the entire project of creation was over, Genesis 1 says, God saw all that He had made, and behold, it was very good. In Exodus 39, when the work of building the sanctuary was completed, we read, Moses saw all the work, and it was, behold, they had done it. The same language used in creation is employed in the building of the tabernacle. When the tabernacle was built and completed, just as God blesses creation, Moses blesses the tabernacle. Just as God sanctified creation, when the tabernacle was built, God sanctifies the tabernacle and all its furnishings. The capstone of creation was the Sabbath. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said that the Sabbath was the last in creation, but the first in intention. Why? Because the whole purpose of creation was not the creation of man and woman. The apex of creation was the fellowship of man and woman with God. That was the whole reason for the project, that we would fellowship with God in our mountain home. The tabernacle, as we said, echoes the creation of our mountain home. The tabernacle became an embodiment of the Sabbath. If you will read how the tabernacle is called in the Old Testament, it is called a tent of meeting. It is the place where we and God could fellowship with one another. Now, why is this so important? When we and God are in fellowship with one another, that is when we are truly human. That is when we are truly what we were created to be. Devoid of that fellowship, separated from God, we are not truly human. We are not at the apex of creation. We are not fulfilling what all this was meant to be. God comes down, dwells with us in His sanctuary, and the sanctuary becomes an embodiment of Sabbath living. God fellowships with human beings. Is it any wonder that God said to Israel, "My Sabbaths you shall guard, my sanctuary you shall revere. I am the Lord." These two are together. The building of the sanctuary was a miniature rebuilding of the mountain garden. Just as the mountain garden was a place where God dwelt with humanity, the tabernacle became a place where God fellowshiped with sinful humanity. Now, the conditions between holiness and sin did not simply evaporate once God built this tabernacle. Humans could meet God there under certain conditions without danger of their obliteration. They needed to be covered by God's forgiveness. They need to be interceded through a priest, the ministry of priests. And once these were put in place, they could face God. They could meet God. They could communicate and hear from God and speak to God. This was how humans outside the mountain could still ascend the mountain of the tabernacle and fellowship with God. David must have caught a glimpse of what this was like, of what this mountain garden existence was like, because David said in Psalm 26, "O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells." Much later, David says, "One thing have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life." This has been the purpose. God wanting us to live in the mountain garden with Him together. Right from the start, this has always been God's goal. Long before David, long after David. Just as in that first mountain garden, God has always wanted us to live in fellowship with Him. In Exodus 15, we read, "You in your loving kindness will lead forth the people you have redeemed. You will guide them by your strength to your holy habitation. You will bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place, O Yahweh, you have made for your own dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established." This is the longing of God's people, that God would replant them in the mountain garden once again. Now, if you read the 10 descriptions that we read in this psalm, the 10 qualifiers of those who will live on the mountain garden with God, you will notice that none of us fully qualifies to be up there. All of us have failed some part of this list. For that matter, we have all failed what this list alludes to. the Ten Commandments. The only person who qualifies to be on God's holy mountain is Jesus. The only person who qualifies to enter into the mountain garden, to enter into the veil of the tabernacle, to dwell in God's presence and on his mountain is Jesus. Jesus alone fits the bill. Jesus alone is fit to govern. Because Jesus fits the bill, because Jesus fits these 10 descriptions in this psalm, Jesus has been given authority to rule. It is because Jesus fits these 10 descriptions that we read, Jesus is now given dominion and is seated at the right hand of the Father to rule. Where does this leave us? How can we go back to the mountain garden? How can we ever be fully human? The only way we can have fellowship with God on God's holy mountain, the only way we can dwell in his sacred tent, is for our lives to be hid in Jesus. To ask for Jesus to live his perfect life in us. To ask Jesus to gift us his perfect character. Only then can we ascend the mountain of the Lord. Only then can we live the life we were meant to live in fellowship with God. Who can dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? None of us. None of us. Except if we are hid in Jesus. Except if he lives his life in us.